I want to talk to you a little today about racial ideology in Nazi Germany. So this is a talk that I became interested in because we were talking about racism in Nazi Germany. We've been teaching this class for a while. And a lot of the racial ideas that the Nazis had were very confusing to me. In other words, well, we know the general gist of things. You know, the Nazis like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans, but they don't like anybody else. Everybody else is sort of inferior to that. That's the kind of thing we know, that the Nazis were sort of guiding their thinking. But certainly there had to be more subtlety to their racist ideas. Okay? And there you see pictures of them going around and examining people's heads, and you see photographs like this where they're comparing people. And so I became very curious about how the Nazis categorized race, and how the Nazis categorized race. And I'm going to begin talking about this by giving you the punchline. Okay, the punchline. Okay, because let's be clear about this. Race is, for the most part, a social construct. It is not really based in biology. The idea that there are significant differences among human beings, and especially, you know, we see in psychology, unfortunately, where there's been a history of significant differences in intelligence among human beings, is really a social construct. It's not a real thing. Okay, and you've had, especially in the history of psychology and intelligence testing, a very, very checkered past of asserting that there are genetic differences in intelligence between different types of, quote, races, unquote. Okay? And you can find books on this stuff, and you'll still, if you go on the internet, you can still find people, you know, trying to propagate these ideas. Really, for the most part, that stuff is just really kind of BS. It's not true. Race is a construct. Okay? That's not to say that we are not different genetically than one another, right? I don't look like this guy. He's handsome, right? I don't look like him, right? You know, we have differences. We have genetic differences, okay? But the genetic differences within are bigger than the genetic differences between people, okay? In other words, your brother and sister, you have a brother who's not a fraternal or not an identical twin. You have a brother or sister. They don't look exactly like you. There's differences there, right? Because there's random shifting of genes and things like that. And it affects things that are, for the most part, very superficial. Our phenotype, how we appear. We have different colorations of skin, of hair. We have different builds. You know, we have all sorts of different shapes, sizes, colors of people. Those are fairly minor differences, okay, that have to do a lot with, at least in some cases, adaptation to environment. And I'll talk about that at the end. So that's what I'm going to talk about at the end of this lecture. I have done this lecture where I talk about this stuff at the beginning. I'm going to save it for the end because it's something I really want to hammer home, that the concept of race, and Reiner has told you this too, the concept of race is a social construction. It is something, if I may be a little postmodern about it for a moment, it is something that certain peoples who have the upper hand foist on the rest of everybody in order to maintain them having the upper hand. Okay? And Reiner has talked to you some degree about colonization. And of course we see this in places where, in nation states that have colonies, you typically will not find a nation state colonizing a, quote, superior, unquote, peoples. People who get colonized are usually always inferior, right? The people who are taken and made into slaves are always, quote, inferior, unquote, right? This is sort of the history of relationships among people. Okay? And so this is a very interesting concept. And, you know, we could elaborate this lecture, and I'll talk a little bit about this today. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but we could elaborate this lecture into a lecture on slavery, for instance, right? Where one people's enslaves another people. In other words, you know, takes away their freedom, forces them to work, and I think we could just as well say rapes the other group of people. And we could talk a little bit about this, and we could go a lot more into detail about this, right? Because slavery is sort of also something that's justified by these racial categories. Okay? And, you know, if you look in the history of the world, you'll see that, you know, lots of groups of people made other groups of people slaves, right? We know we have a very shameful history of this in the United States. Okay? My ancestors who worked for the the Sultan of Turkey would go into Eastern Europe and go on raids and take Eastern European people and bring them back to, I don't know, what is now Istanbul, and turn them into slaves, and sometimes turn them into eunuchs who were castrated slaves. Yeah, shameless plug, I'll be talking about that in my other class. And you could go on. I mean, everybody here probably could find some example, if they went far enough back in their history, of their ancestors doing these sorts of horrible things, and or finding history of where your ancestors were subject to these horrible things. And this goes back to my first lecture, right? Remember I talked to you about Freud, you know, categorizing, you know, sort of framing human beings as sort of being these really not very nice people, right? And so this is part and parcel of that. And so racism is intertwined with this sort of history of human beings. So Reiner's already talked to you about this stuff, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. And you know, basically, when I've given this talk before outside of the university, I just crib off Reiner's slides and just add them into my own lecture. I give him credit for it because that's what we do in academia. But for you guys, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I did want to mention a couple things about European racism. And Reiner already talked to you about the limpieza de sangre in Spain. We can mention a couple other things here, and you can go back and look at the ancient Greeks, etc. But interesting to me was this idea under King Louis XIV, I believe it was, the so-called Black Code in 1685, and also this evolved into something called the Code of Louisiana. Remember where Louisiana was from, that the United States bought Louisiana from, right? Bought it from the French. It was a French colony. And this was a very interesting code because it's something that codified and established a legal means for slavery in the French colonies. Not all the colonies, it didn't include Canada, that's what I read. But it could define the conditions of slavery. And again, the slaves were mostly people from African descent. Okay, and it defined conditions including sex, who can have sex with who was, you know, if you were a white woman having sex with a male slave and you had children, were your children free or were they slaves? Well, if the white woman gave birth to the children would be free. Okay, it was the other way around, where you had a white man and a black woman, and you produced children. Those children would be slaves. And so this law codified all this kind of stuff. Who married who was allowed to marry, whether people could get together and assemble, whether people could be merchants and buy and sell things, how the buying and selling of the slaves themselves was accomplished, the relationships between the slave and the master, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And this code also limited the activity, by the way, of the so-called free Negroes, the free black people, and also limited religion. Because the church got involved and they sort of put their rider in on this, and their rider was that only Catholicism would be allowed, and it banned the practice of other religions, and it also stipulated that slaves must be baptized as Catholic. And maybe for the you know, what might be related to this class is that this also the Black Code also removed all Jews from France's colonies. So again, this is really blatant instance of anti-Semitism. Now, if we can talk a little bit about German anti-Semitism, and I think Reiner mentioned this a little bit. Again, there's more to this than this. I'm just giving you sort of the overview, but we can talk about the theologian Martin Luther. You guys might know about Martin Luther because he was the religious Christian guy who led essentially a rebellion against the Catholic Church. And you might have heard about him, you know, nailing his 95 Theses to the door. You know, he basically stipulated that we don't need, so I'm going to simplify this to a great degree, we don't need the church to intervene between us and God, right? I think I'm getting that roughly correctly, right? You do not need, for instance, the Virgin Mary as the cosmic mediatrix, the, you know, switchboard operator to put you into God. You know, you don't need your prayers to go through the Pope, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that you can have a direct relationship to God. And this becomes known really in two ways. And again, I don't know, you know, the details of the history of the Christian church. You can take Dr. Baker's class on that, Psychology of Christianity, which I highly recommend. But you get really two movements out of that. You get the Protestant movement, which is where you get Protestants, and you get other ones who are Lutherans, named after Martin Luther. And this is a very interesting, line of this and how this comes to America. It goes to England, and of course it's Henry VIII who, wants to get divorced from one wife and marry another wife. So he sort of, adopts this, and there's a very good TV series about Henry VIII you can watch, which I'm always amazed at how clean they are in the TV series. People back in those times would not have been nearly so clean. Take a bath like once a year at most, But anyway, there's a good, you can read about this stuff, and then how this stuff comes to the United States and these religions get established here. But Luther also was very influential with regard to the treatment of the Jews in Europe. And he started his career being very sympathetic to Jewish individuals, with the idea that they had undergone this diaspora, they'd undergone this plight, they were treated really poorly, and we as Christians, we should take them in and, most importantly, convert them, right? Convert them to Christianity so they can see the light, and then then all will be well, right? And so Luther starts out his career this way, but later on he denounces Judaism. He comes to the conclusion that we really can't convert them. They're just terrible, and he called on for harsh treatment of Jews. And so he wrote this book in 1543 called On Jews and Their Lies, and you may see, I'll read you some quotes from this, and you may see some similarity to later Nazi activities. Okay. So quote, this is from Luther: "First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, I advise their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews. In other words, if you see a Jewish individual out on the highway and you feel like robbing them, go for it. Because they have no business in the countryside. Sixth, I advise that usury, which is loaning money, be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, a distaff, or spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. But if we are afraid they might harm us or our wives, children, servants, cattle, etc., let us then emulate the common sense of other nations such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc., and then eject them forever from the country." Okay. So here you see Luther's ideas from 1543, and you can see, I'm sure from those things I just read, a clear connection to the anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. Now, if you read Goldhagen's book, he will make the case that this sort of anti-Semitism early on in German history, as well as other things, leads to, by the time of the Nazi era, this sort of eliminationist anti-Semitism. Okay? Whether you buy that idea or not, I mean, clearly, this has been something that has been brewing in Europe for a long time. Now, Reiner talked to you about eugenics, so I'm not going to go into any detail about that, just to say that, as Reiner already told you, that eugenics was very popular here in the United States. And again, there's lots of propaganda. I like this one. Are you fit to marry, fathers and mothers? You better make sure your kids are getting together with the proper person who will be a legitimately good spouse for them. You don't want them going around with, some kind of floozy who might, really be carrying bad genetics, because we know this kind of behavior is really genetically determined, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this kind of thing. Okay? So I like this one. I think this one's pretty good, especially, this, because, bad genetics means you're going to listen to jazz, right? That can be dangerous. Okay? And of course, anybody who's got kids knows that this is still, or has parents, knows that this sort of thing, your parents are very interested in who you take up with. Let's just hope that's not done from a eugenic standpoint. Okay? Some eugenic stuff about the United States that you ought to know, because you are here in hearing this lecture in a former mental hospital that was run by the state of California. And of course, eugenics, especially negative eugenics, were practiced here to some degree. And we have the legislative status of eugenical sterilization in the United States. This is a map showing a map in each state where the eugenics sterilization was performed, number of operations by each state to January 1935. Okay? And so you can see these states here, and I don't know if you can see this, the numbers very clearly, but for instance here you have Arizona, 11 people were sterilized, Utah 94, Oregon 988, that's pretty big, Iowa 160, Oklahoma 49, New York 200. How many in California here? It looks like 9,997. Okay, where were these operations, where were they performed? You know where the library is now? That was the hospital, and that's where they would have been performed here. Okay, so the stuff went on in California, went on a number of states. There's a very famous case from Virginia, by the way, which also had a pretty high number. I think it's in the 2000s or something. It's a very famous case that went up to the Supreme Court about a woman from Virginia. And by the way, some of those laws, even though they are not acted upon, are still in effect in the United States. Japan is an interesting, a little side note, Japan is interesting because Japan's eugenics laws allowed forced sterilization and they remained in effect until 1996. 1996. And there are now, this is a recent article, newspaper article, there's now people, including a woman who is suing the government of Japan over forced sterilization under these old eugenics laws. Okay. So again, these are ideas that don't go swiftly into the night and are forgotten, but are stuff that is still around and is still affecting the world even today. Now you take a look at California's eugenics laws here. It's a little timeline here, and you see that in California all these laws were not repealed until 1979, when California finally repeals all non-consensual sterilization laws. Okay? But in 2000-2006, California prisons illegally sterilized 148 unwilling female prisoners. Yikes, pretty current. 2003, California issues a formal apology to the victims of sterilization laws, but still after that, there was still some illegal sterilization going on. So you can read this stuff for yourself here and see these things. So again, this is not a pleasant part of our history here, but something you guys should know about. Okay, and of course, as Reiner also mentioned, eugenics was part of the intellectual establishment. It was something that was propagated at major universities, and here's an article about eugenics at Harvard that you can read about. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to pass this on. But also had to do a lot with this guy, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who became a Supreme Court justice and was one of the first American intellectuals to espouse eugenics. Oliver Wendell Holmes is sometimes held out as a kind of a hero, especially he's a very smart guy. He was a medical doctor, Harvard medical doctor, and dean of Harvard Medical School, and acclaimed writer who becomes a Supreme Court justice and did all these amazing things. But one of the maybe not so great things is he was a proponent of eugenics. Okay? And when he sat on the Supreme Court, and these eugenics cases came to him about people complaining about being forced to be sterilized and things like this, he usually voted in favor of eugenics. And by the way, I should mention the role of mental hospitals. The mental hospitals were a place that facilitated things like forced sterilization and things like this. All right, and eugenics in Nazi Germany, Reiner has talked to you about this. And so you know a little bit about this now. But the thing is, okay, we have eugenics to breed or get rid of, breed good racial characteristics or get rid of bad racial characteristics. But what we don't have a sense of is really what are the specifics of those racial characteristics. And we can put this in sort of a structuralist, intentionalist argument, and we can ask ourselves some questions. First of all, who are racists? How does somebody get to become a racist? Now, I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to tell you, as a psychologist standpoint, you will probably have gotten most of your racial views from your parents. As a small child, you're exposed to the viewpoints of your parents. Your parents are the ones who teach you about the world. And so most people get their racial views, even their conceptions of race, or non-conceptions of race, they get from their parents. Okay? And so this is something that gets passed on to people. Again, you have Dr. Baker here talk about this. But if we want to look at a bigger picture than just sort of individual psychology, we can ask sort of in these questions, can anybody be a racist in the right circumstances? And this is perhaps more of a structuralist argument. This would follow along Christopher Browning. This would follow along what I talked about when I talked about the good old days and the Einsatz group, and that human beings maybe have an innate programming that gets activated under certain circumstances where they think somebody who's outside of the group other, it's okay to persecute them or to classify them as inferior in some way, treat them in a bad way, right? And again, from my first lecture, I talked about, this may be a primate sort of thing where anybody in the out group, if you're primates and you have your in group, anybody in the out group is suspect, okay? And so this would be point to the sort of more structuralist argument. Okay, so if the structure is right, you're identified with your in group very strongly, and there's people from the out group who are perceived as threats, then it becomes very convenient to attach a racial designation to the out group. Usually this racial designation is a bad one. Not always. For instance, the Nazis looked at people in Norway and they said, well, those are really blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans. So, we think that they really should be, we can include them. Doesn't prevent us from going and invading their country and taking over, but, we think racially they are fit. Okay? And they'll see the light because they really are, they just don't know they're in the in-group yet. Okay? And so you have some cases like that, and there's also some evidence that the Nazis also thought about Hitler at least thought about the British this way. Right? The British really are, pretty good racial stock, and they just need to realize that they're part of our group, and they'll come around. And then we have maybe think of it as more of an intentionalist argument, more along the Goldhagen type of viewpoint, where specific groups of people come under the influence maybe of a leader, a big man, and they combine that with a certain past history, and this may lead people to more likely be racist, right? In other words, this is something that is the intention of somebody who is a high status individual, and this feeds into people's racial views. And again, if you think about this psychologically, this is just, in other words, it's sort of an elaboration of what I just said. You've probably all got your racial views from your parents. Who are the big men in your own personal history? Your parents, right? So if you elaborate, you take this parental developmental model and you elaborate it out at a society level, you could kind of make a case similar maybe to what Goldhagen is saying. Your parents, this big man has a past history, and then they influence you and the next generation, and you become racist. Right? And of course, we know from reading Mein Kampf that Hitler said all these sort of things, and obviously this may have influenced people toward their racial beliefs. Okay? Now, I present these sort of quasi-structural and intentionalist arguments here. Probably, I would say, in my belief, that the truth is going to be some mixture of these. Okay? That neither of these purely are what's going on, but certainly there's some mixture of these things. So how do the Nazis conceive race? What were their racial conceptions? How do they actually, what are the nuts and bolts of how they thought about different peoples? We know they didn't like Jews. This is a stereotypical picture of a Jewish individual. And Reiner, this word, bastard. Okay? The Jew is a bastard, meaning that Jews are made up of all sorts of different races. They're mongrels, right? And a bunch of different races. Okay? And so this is one of the guiding principles of Nazi racial conceptions and Nazi anti-Semitism. What about everybody else? So we'll talk about this. So the Führer, Adolf Hitler, articulated the ideas that came to be known as Nazi ideology, racial ideology. He thought of himself as a deep and profound thinker. He was convinced he had found the key to understand an extraordinarily complex world. He believed that a person's characteristics, attitudes, abilities, and behaviors were determined by his or her so-called racial makeup. In Hitler's views, all groups, races, or peoples, and he used these terms interchangeably, carried within them traits that were immutably transmitted from one generation to the next. No individual could overcome the innate qualities of race. And all human history could be explained in terms of a racial struggle. Now, no individual could overcome the innate qualities of the race. What kind of racism is this? From Dr. Bushman's lecture. What's the word that Dr. Bushman used? You should know this because this will probably be in the test. What kinds of racism do you have? This is definitely going to be in the test. Okay? So what kind of racism is the racism that is immutable? Does not change. You can't change it no matter what. And you could say it's biologically determined. Yes. Hard racism, yes, hard racism. As opposed to, and what's soft racism? You can change, how can you change? You can change your culture. Yeah, and you have the ability to do that. Okay? So Hitler's racism was what kind of racism? Hard racism. Okay, biologically determined. Okay. Remember I mentioned to you about Hitler liked a lot of biological metaphors. In his speeches, he gave a lot of speeches with biological metaphors, sort of conceptualizing Germany as a body, with invading pathogens, right? And so a lot of his racial conception has a lot of this biology, or at least his conception of biology, because he doesn't know that much about biology, but this is the conception of it, okay? Now, Hitler did not make these ideas up about race, okay? He got these from someplace. And of course, you saw from the picture of Martin Luther that some of this stuff was coming, from way back when, and other stuff was coming from newer ideas. And in formulating their ideology of race, Hitler and the Nazis drew upon not only Germans like Martin Luther, but also from social Darwinists of the late 19th century. What's social Darwinism? You guys know about this?
Yes.
What is it?
It's, oh God, they help me explain it.
First of all, what's Darwinism?
It's basically what Darwinism comes from Charles Darwin, and then during that time, people started to branch off of Darwinism called social Darwinism. People started, somebody help me, I know how to explain it.
Well, let's break it down. What did Darwin say? Yes. Well, we'll be more specific about it. Yes. What did Darwin say?
Evolution of the fittest.
So Darwin proposed a theory. It's not really a theory. I mean, it's a scientific theory. He proposed a mechanism of natural selection. Okay? And what does natural selection say? Yes.
It's like if the most individual adapts to the situation.
Yeah. So the organisms that adapt to the situation are able to do, better adapted to the situation, are able to do what? To what? To reproduce, produce more offspring. Okay? So those who are more fit are able to do what?
Produce more offspring.
Produce more offspring, and therefore whatever characteristics they have that help them adapt to their environment are passed on, are carried on. Okay? And again, this also, and what causes those, some individuals to have certain characteristics and some not to, initially?
Genetics, like who they associate with or they have offspring with.
Not quite. Where does the variation come in genetics? You have a bunch of fruit flies, for instance, in a jar. And my sister-in-law does experiments with fruit flies, by the way, and you can very easily demonstrate the principles of natural selection in the lab with fruit flies. You got a bunch of fruit flies, you put one jar of them in the cold, and then the ones who breed become, I'm just making this up, they become better able to adapt to cold, right? Where is that genetic variation coming from for the fruit flies? What is it? No, this is where people misunderstand Darwin. It comes from random mutation. That within our genetics, there's plenty of random variation, random mutation in our genes. Okay? And this is where I mean when I talk to you about human beings having more variation within our species than between different groups of people. Okay? That we get random mutation. This is the reason why you don't look like your brother or your sister exactly, unless you're an identical twin. Okay? You got your DNA from the same place, but it got shuffled differently. Okay? Or you had a random mutation, that showed up in your genetic material. Okay? And so what happens is natural selection favors beneficial mutations. Most mutations, by the way, are not beneficial. Okay? This is why you don't go out in the sun and, get a sunburn all the time, because you get lots of breaking up of your DNA and you get mutations, and most of them are not beneficial, especially sunburn will lead to cancer, right? But over time, eventually you'll get some, for a specific situation, you'll get some mutations that randomly are beneficial. And then the environment will favor those, and those people with those random mutations will have more offspring, and then that trait will become established in the population. That's the mechanism of natural selection. Okay? And again, you can go in the lab. My sister-in-law does this all the time. She does all sorts of experiments with fruit flies, and scientists can demonstrate this conclusively in the lab. Okay? The mechanism of natural selection. That is not the only thing Darwin talked about, but that was one of the main things he talked about. By the way, later in his life, he came to not believe this. He kind of, maybe it's not true. He kind of got some self-doubt going on near the end of his life. So another story, we won't go into that here. So what is social Darwinism? I have a reason for trying to distinguish between these two things. And you guys have already said this a little bit. Yes?
So social Darwinism is based on your social class. I think, because Andrew Carnegie, they were he's successful because he has a trait that makes him successful.
Close, very close. You're getting to it. You guys already sort of alluded to it. Okay? Social Darwinism was actually something that was proposed. Darwin was not the big proponent of this. It was people like Spencer and some other people who wrote about this, applying Darwin's ideas to looking at human society. And the idea here was that the humans who essentially were the ones who were the colonizers and not the colonizees, the slaveholders, not the slave. The idea was because they had better genetics, because they had more competition, and so they had to develop bigger brains and become smarter. And it was, and they were that's the reason that they were on the top of the social pyramid. Okay, so in other words, if you looked at, and again, a lot of these ideas originated in England. What's the reason that England was able to colonize all these people? Because the English were superior, and they were superior. Why? Because they were able to outfight, essentially, they had, or outfight other peoples, okay, because of their whatever genetic makeup. Okay? So social Darwinism, not exactly the same as the theory of natural selection. It is in some ways, a bastardization of the theory of natural selection. And by the way, there's some really interesting literature on this I would recommend. Why would some groups of human beings be able to rise up to the position where they are able to sort of control other groups of people? This is a question that people have asked. And again, if you put your evolutionary hat on, I would recommend you read books by a guy named Jared Diamond, who wrote a number of wonderful books, one of which talks about how certain peoples, certain groups of people were able to basically ascend to having a higher technology and be able to sort of control other peoples, basically because of two things. One is that they lived in a region where they could grow food, that would allow them to store the food, which allowed people in that society to become specialists in doing things like creating weapons. And the other thing is that those peoples also were able to have animals that they could use for food. They were able to what's the word I want to say, domesticate animals for food. And also, because they lived in close harmony with those animals, they were able to develop immunity to certain diseases. In other words, you lived near cows, you got cowpox when you were young, and then that protected you from getting smallpox later on. And if you then later on came into contact with a group of people who had never been exposed to cowpox or smallpox, those people would very virulently get the disease, smallpox disease, and die from it. And this, of course, is what happened when Europeans came to the New World, came to the Americas. And the natives here had not been exposed to things like smallpox and died in huge numbers. Okay? Now, there's some argument about whether that exposure was intentional or not, but it resulted in Native Americans dying, huge numbers of Native Americans dying. If you're a social Darwinist, you would say, it's because, the British coming to the United States, they were superior. They had superior genetics, and so, that's why they were able to come here and, dominate the Native Americans, right? But Jared Diamond's argument is that, no, it really has to do with sort of where you were, where your culture developed geographically, which, resulted in, again, closest to animals and ability to develop food sources that you could store. Because you can store food sources. I grow wheat. I can store the wheat. I can have big silos full of grain, and I can have food surpluses, which that means that everybody in the society doesn't have to go out and be constantly foraging or trying to grow food or hunting, that people can then develop specialties. Okay? And in his book, he argues that certain parts of the world this occurred, and this is where the great civilizations of the world took place. Okay? Now, you can poke holes in this argument. It's a pretty deterministic argument, but in my opinion, I think there's a grain of truth to this. And in my opinion, this also underlies the sort of arguments for social Darwinism. In other words, if people let's say, pick a place, people in Australia, in the outback, had been able to grow, wheat, and had animals, had cows, and, were able to then, spend time, developing, technologies like metallurgy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They may be the ones who are going to England and colonizing the English rather than the other way around, with the English going to Australia and colonizing. An interesting argument. But this is why, according to Diamond, this underlines the idea of social Darwinism. Okay? It has nothing to do with these people's genetics. It has to do with the luck of where they ended up being born and the resources available to them in that place. Yes, there were genetic adaptations to living in those places. One of the genetic adaptations of people living in Northern Europe, what was it? Maybe one of the most important ones with regard to this lecture. What do people in Northern Europe adapt? How do they adapt to their environment? An environment where they're not getting lots of sunlight all the time, but the body needs things like vitamin D that's made from sunlight. Okay, they're not getting a lot of vitamin D in the diet. It's cold. The sun isn't out all the time. So what do their skin do? It becomes lighter. It becomes lighter so it can absorb more of the sun. It can create more vitamin D. Right? So an adaptation to the environment is whiter skin. So people in northern climes develop whiter skin, or are paler than people who come from places where there's more sunshine. Okay? But developing whiter skin really has nothing to do with you being a superior person. It just means your ancestors lived in a place that had less sunlight. Okay? But if you also combine that in Diamond's idea with a place where you can have food surpluses and you can have immunity to animal diseases, and you can develop technology, then you get a people who are able to go out and colonize, as the British did, colonize a large part of the world. Okay? You can make but does that have anything to do with their white skin? The genetics of having whiter skin? No. No. And we know that, having white skin does not mean that only people with white skin can go out and conquer the world. Because we sure as hell know, and again, shameless plug for our History and Psych 436 class in the fall, we sure know that Genghis Khan, took over a large part of the world, and he wasn't white. Okay? Now, what did Genghis Khan have? He had superior technology, for one thing. He had some superior technology, and he had the ability to adapt to other technologies. Okay? And he was able to have a huge empire. And we're going to talk about that in the fall, so come take our class. It's going to be very interesting. Talk to you all about Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and interesting things. So again, you have to be careful about the social Darwinist stuff. Okay? Be very careful about this stuff. Social Darwinists are where a lot of these racial classifications come from. it becomes quite convenient. It becomes quite convenient if I'm the conqueror to justify my subjugating other people. It becomes really quite good for me to be able to say, well, you know, we subjugated these people, we've turned them into slaves, we make them work for us, you know, we've taken over their land and their territory, but really it's because they're inferior to us. And we, as the, you know, the superior people, have a noblesse oblige that we, you know, that we are bringing civilization to these folks. And so it's really good for them to be subjugated. And this is the standard rationale of the colonizer. Okay? And if you read British writings about, you know, British colonies in India and elsewhere, you know, Africa, wherever, this is the kind of language you get. Okay? We're colonizing. We're bringing civilization to them. It's okay for us to have slaves because you know, now they're saved. Their eternal souls are saved because we have them become Christians. Okay? All these kinds of rationale. And these things can be traced back to kind of a social Darwinist argument. And so the idea of collective races, of people being races, you know, comes with this. Okay? Human beings that can be classified into races, each race bearing a distinctive characteristic that's passed on genetically. And these inherited characteristics are not only related to outward appearance, but also to inward things like intelligence, mental ability, thinking, ways of thinking, their ability to be creative, their ability to organize, their ability to create a society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what racial categories do is they make a clear connection between outward appearance and other unseen inward abilities, mental capacity, ways of thinking, creative organizational abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are signified by the outward appearance. Okay? And this idea, again, is very convenient for we'll call them colonizers, okay? But has no basis in biological fact. Okay? It's just a convenient thing. So again, race is a social construct. It's a social construct that ties outward physical appearance to a person's unseen abilities. So if a person is a certain color, then that's a signifier that they have less of these good qualities and more of the bad qualities. Okay? And this is the construct that the colonists use, the colonizers use, to subjugate people and to justify their colonization, justify their subjugation of other people. And again, here you go. This is a good example. The Nazis looking outward appearance. So the Nazis refined this looking for outward appearance stuff to a very, very high degree. And they did it by using things such as, you know, discredited scientific methods like or theories such like phrenology, which is looking at the shape and the bumps on a person's head. Well, the Nazis, you know, by the time of the Nazi era, you know, phrenology had been pretty much discredited, but it sort of pops up in a new form, which is that you look at the ratios of different parts of the body. You know, they had maybe the distance between the ears or the distance between the eyes, and you know, you look at certain measurements of characteristics that signify internal genetic constructs. Okay? In other words, the idea that you could look at a person, you could take measurements of their head, you know, these different things, and tell whether the person was Aryan or whether they were Jewish. You could look at certain signifiers like eye color, the nose length, the ratio of the eyes, how close the eyes are together, how long the nose is. And from these outward appearances, you could tell somebody's race. And by the way, the Nazis invested a lot of time and energy in this stuff. Okay? Was this scientific? Did this have any scientific basis? Absolutely not. Because the difference in these things, again, from the general population due to, you know, sort of random variation, is greater than would be, you know, if you actually compared different groups of people. In other words, if I went around and looked at head size in this room, measured head size in this room, okay, you know, you got a pretty big head, your head's smaller, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I go around the room here, there's going to be some variation in this, okay? There's some variation in this. That variation will not correlate to what race you are, or it'll be very little correlation. It has nothing to do with what your, for instance, your skin color might be. But head size will differ, right? Even among people who are your own race, who may look like you, you're going to find a lot of variation in head size, okay? So those things are, those are biological things. Nazis did not pay attention to the science of that. They conveniently ignored that because they had people up top telling them we need to find this stuff. They devote a lot of time, energy, and money and resources to these sorts of things. Okay? Now, the counter to this is that if you're an anthropologist and you go and you dig up a skull, and you take measurements of the skull, you can tell what a person's outer appearance looked like with fair amount of certainty. Okay? That it is possible to correlate this with what I'm going to call superficial stuff. Okay? Superficial stuff. Especially if you dug that head up or that skull in a certain place and you know what people there look like anyway, you can do these kinds of things. The question is that a valid, and this is actually a contemporary question, is that a valid thing to do? Is that a valid thing? And this is what happens. So, and what happens is these anthropological techniques get applied to crime scenes. So we go and we find a body that's been dumped in a river, it's decomposed, we take the skull out, and the forensic pathologist will then take measurements of the skull, they'll look for certain signs and symbols and say, yeah, this person was a black person, this person was from Latin America, this person was white. Okay? And the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean that races are, again, do they really exist? And the argument is that, again, looking at those superficial characteristics and combining them in a certain way really is still a social construct. Okay? You'll find some people who disagree with that. There's some controversy and people are still thinking about this. But I will say I think the majority of people say it's still a social construct. Okay? And the way the Nazis were doing this was not anywhere nearly as specific as what what forensic pathologists do nowadays. All right. Let's look at the specific racial views, Nazi racial views. Races exist in a strict hierarchy. This is the first one. There's strict hierarchy. The hierarchy is, I don't need to say this, I'm sure you know this, the hierarchy goes from good to bad. Okay? Good, not quite as good, better, best, okay, slightly inferior, more inferior, really inferior. Okay? And at the bottom, evil. Now, guess who is in the bottom category? We'll get to that in a moment. There are three European races in order of superiority: the Aryan/Nordics, the Alpines, and the Mediterranean. The majority of Europeans are Alpines, the middle category. The Mediterraneans are ones that you find where? Near the Mediterranean, the south of Europe. Okay? And that would include Italians. Okay? So when you saw in the movie, the other day, if our Italian friends, do not remove their Jews, we will go down there and accomplish it for them. There is a little smirk and a little subtle smear of their Italian allies because they are thinking that the Italians are not quite as good as they are, because they are mostly Mediterraneans and we Germans are Aryan Nordics and Alpines. All right? So again, we'll have to go down there and sort their Jewish problem out for them. Right? Non-European races, and this includes Africans, Asians, Arabs, indigenous people from all around the world, all of these people are seen as inferior to Europeans. Okay? These people, while inferior, are not considered to be evil. They're just not as good. But that's okay, because that means they're suitable for slave labor. They're not evil. We can enslave them all. They'll be our workers. It'll be fine. Okay? Number 4, Jews. Jews are a non-European race that is made up of a mixture of all the other non-European races. In addition to being considered inferior, they're also thought of as evil and the natural enemy of Europeans. In other words, I had that slide for you before. Where is it? In the beginning of the slide. Where is it? Put that. Do that. Sure I showed you guys that slide, didn't I have it here? This one. Okay, so here you go. Orientals, black people. I'm assuming, Reiner, this says something having to do with, this look like Egyptians,
Yeah, this is Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia.
It means before Asia. So in other words, it would be southwestern Asia.
Indonesia.
So places like Mesopotamia.
Okay.
Egypt possibly too.
So all these people
Middle
mixed,
East mostly.
all these people mixed together with this bastard, right? The Jewish person, right? He's a mixture of all these people. Now, any of these people by themselves are inferior, but not evil. But if you mix them all together genetically and produce this person, this guy is evil. And he's the natural enemy to the Europeans. Okay? The Roma and Sinti people, pejoratively called gypsies, also thought to be of mixed racial heritage and therefore degenerate. That's right.
This brings up the scene in the movie again, the contradiction between on one hand, the Nazis portraying the Jewish individuals as a sort of degenerate individual, but on the other hand, they're very clever and sinister and undermining. The disagreement that the two people
Yeah,
have,
yeah.
the lawyer who created
Yeah.
the Nuremberg Law with the party official.
Not have them desecrate the Christ, right? He yells out, they're clever, right? And the other one's just think, oh, they're just dumb, we just need to get rid of them, right? So this is
When he
a,
says pigs don't know how to.
exactly. So this is one of the big contradictions you find in the Nazis, is their conception of Jews is not clear, even among themselves. They have this sort of mixed conception. And again, this also goes back to the politics, that Jews are, really Bolsheviks, they're really communists. At the same time, they're running a capitalist cabal to take over all the banks. But communists don't really like banks, they don't like capitalism, so this is another contradiction. These are overlooked by the Nazis, very conveniently overlooked. And you saw in the movie the arguments about these kind of things. Okay? Now, put my Freudian cap on here for a second. Jews are also characterized as being incredibly sexually promiscuous. Okay? And again, I mentioned this in propaganda. If you really want to demonize somebody, just say that they're all the men in that group are coming after your wives, daughters, sisters, etc. And that's a good way to demonize people. So again, Jews are also ascribed to having a voracious sexual appetite, and not just for other Jewish people, but specifically for Aryan maidens. Okay, so this is part of the evil, being evil, right? They're evil. They want to come after your sister, your mother, your wife, your daughter, and they're going to seduce her. Okay, so again, this is that contradiction. If they're really dumb and stupid, then how can they do this? Well, no, they're really clever and they're sneaky, right? And they're evil. So this is what they're trying to do here. Okay? And so you'll see this kind of conception quite a lot. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different races. The Aryans and Nordics, thought to be narrow-skulled, fair-skinned, tall, light-colored hair, light-colored eyes. The group was superior in mental, physical, and cultural achievements. And in fact, the Nazis felt all great cultures in the world in history were produced by Aryans. So if you look back to the ancient Greeks, probably an Aryan culture, right? And hence when you saw the movie Olympia and they start carrying the torch, they start down in Greece and they show these pictures of these people looking like these Greek statues. Yeah, that's all, they're Aryans, and they kind of migrated up to Germany, and now we're the Aryans. All that kind of stuff is in the symbolism of that. Okay? They're responsible for all the great accomplishments throughout history. The Alpines are the most numerous Europeans. They're characterized by brown hair, brown eyes, a rounded skull, and shorter stature. They're considered hardworking and honest, but not very creative and lacking leadership skills. Okay? Now, some contradictions here, because what did Hitler look like? Hitler looked like an Alpine. You had to characterize Hitler, you'd say he was an Alpine, right? Well, and he was, the great leader, right? So again, you see a contradiction here. Again, that joke, right, that I always tell you, right? You're blonde like Hitler, thin like Goering, and tall like Goebbels, right? Because Goebbels was short and had a club foot, right? So again, people were aware of these kind of things, Now, what would be the argument? Well, okay, maybe I look like an Alpine, but the thing is, the reason, that we're trying to Aryanize Germany is because, our race has been tainted. by lesser blood, okay, coming from other places. So the Aryans, the Nordics, are least tainted, okay? They're the most pure of the Europeans. The other Europeans, the Alpines, and especially the Mediterraneans, their genetics have been tainted by other non-European peoples. The Alpines to a lesser degree, the Mediterraneans to a higher degree. Mediterraneans, they're near Africa, they're near the Middle East, they're near the Arabs, and so there's been some intermixing there. And so that's why they are less, why they're inferior to the other European groups. Mediterraneans, dark skin, hair, eyes, thought to be a result of intermixing of Arabs and Africans. And so they're thought to be somewhat degenerate. Now, Mussolini, by the way, considered Aryan. Okay? If you found somebody from some place and you wanted to have you needed their help for something, or they were your ally, or Hitler liked you, because Hitler really liked Mussolini, they get categorized as Aryans. And Reiner's going to show you later on an example of some Middle Eastern people who get taken to Germany, and because they are aligning themselves with Germany, they get classified as Aryans, or honorary Aryans, however you want to talk about it. Yes?
I know that there are also blonde hair, blue-eyed Italians too, so they be Aryan or still Mediterranean?
Yes, very good question. So what happens when you go to these places, like Italy, and you find blonde hair, blue-eyed people? Well, you say, there was some German blood, some Aryan blood, somewhere along the line in the background, this person's carrying Aryan ancestry, and so how much of their genetics, how much of their blood, and I'm using blood and genetics kind of interchangeably because that's how they were doing it, how much of it is Aryan? Well, we said they're pretty Aryan. So for Italians, it wouldn't have made much difference because they are aligned with the Germans. But what about you're the German Wehrmacht, and you're going in toward Russia, you're going into Lithuania, you go through Poland, you go to Lithuania, and you found a family, you go to a village, you kill everybody in the village, all the men and the women, and you notice that there's a kid there, and that kid is blonde hair, blue eye. Well, hey, there's some Aryan blood in that kid. That kid looks like they're mostly Aryan. So guess what? We take that kid, we snatch him up, send him back to Germany to be raised by an SS family, and preserve that German blood, right? Preserve that, especially if the majority of their makeup is Aryan, and we want to preserve that. Nazis want to preserve that. And they were alluding to that in the movie a little bit too. What about with mixed people, Jewish and Aryan, Jewish and German? What about that part of their German blood? What about the part of their blood that's German? We need to protect that, right? So that was part of the argument of the movie. But they did this. When they went in, they would find, sometimes the family would be intact. There'd be a mom and a dad and a little blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid. They'd snatch that kid, send him back to Germany, and have him be raised by an SS family. Okay? And so if it was a young woman, they might send her off to the Lebensborn home to breed with SS officers. Okay? So again, they were aware of that. They would see this kind of thing. Okay? And by the way, you can be in lots of places and see lots of people of all sorts of different backgrounds, right? Go to a place like Turkey. You can walk downtown Istanbul, you'll see dark, sort of swarthy, dark-skinned people. You will see people who are blonde-haired, blue-eyed. You will see people who are Asian from Mongolia, right? So again, there are places in the world where you see lots of mixtures of people. Okay? But that's messy. So, it's messy, too complicated for this. Keep things simple. Now, what about Slavic people? And this is, speaking of messy, this is where it gets a little messy. Generally, Slavic people, Russians, other Slavs, are considered to be Untermenschen. They're considered to be subhuman, kind of like the Jews. They have a mixed race heritage. And this is really the case for people such as Russians and Ukrainians. Racial categorization of Slavs depended on how they were seen politically and changed during the Nazi regime. For example, before the war, some Slavs, such as the Southern Slavic Dinaric people, were seen as Indo-Aryans and thus superior to all other races except Nordic Aryans. Prior to 1940, Serbs were seen favorably as descendants from Germanic Goths. Later, after the Serb-led anti-Nazi coup in Yugoslavia, Serbs are seen as degenerate Slavs, and the Croat is favored as being more Germanic. So again, when you talk about your race being your social construct, this is sort of a concrete example of this. Okay? That if they're politically against us, then we recategorize their race. If they're politically with us, we categorize them in a more favorable way. So here's a map of this kind of thing. The bright red are the Nordics. The pink is what's called continental Nordics. Green is Alpines, and yellow is Mediterraneans. Now, if you look at this map, you'll notice this is a little different than what I was just telling you from the Nazi racial pamphlets. For instance, all these people here in Russia are categorized as continental Nordics, Aryans. Okay? And again, you see lots of Alpines in here, and you see lots of continental Nordics, and you see down here Mediterranean. People are categorized as Mediterraneans, but some of these Mediterraneans go into Turkey, they go into other places, North Africa. The difference is because this is a British map, and these categorizations of Aryan/Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean actually come from the British. They come from the British, and they're adapted by the Nazis. A little more, the Nazis are a little strict, because they think all these people here are all bad. Okay. But again, these racial categorizations really come from the English. And English also were fairly racist and fairly anti-Semitic. Okay. So just so you know, it's not just the Nazis and the Germans who had these sort of racial categorizations, but other people did as well. And this brings up any questions about the Nazi racial categorizations? Okay. Now, what we'd like to tell you is that really, you know, in the European sphere of things, you know, the British maybe came up with these things, the Nazis adapted them to their own purposes, and then after World War II, everybody, you know, got together saying kumbaya, and we realized that we're all really racist, a social construct, and, you know, racism is over, right? But of course, I'm sure as you all know, that is not true, and we still have plenty of racism going around today. And so one thing we can ask ourselves is, how do these Nazi racial categorizations reflect in the United States society? Okay. And so I think this is a part of the lecture I've added to, because we now are experiencing in our country a sort of resurgence or a thought that maybe among some people that expressing racist ideas is okay. And we had a campus, in this instance, in a campus where some people put a pro-white supremacy sticker or sign up on campus in certain places. And you know, if you watch the media or whatever, you can see some of these kind of racist stuff coming out now. And so I thought it'd be a little bit, it might be useful to talk about racial categorization in the United States. Okay? And for you guys, for the purpose of this class, I think it's interesting to see how this might relate to the Nazi categorizations. And so, as you know, lots of people coming into the United States, you know, we are a nation of immigrants. Okay, unless you're Native American, your ancestors immigrated. Well, if you're Native American, your ancestors immigrated here a long time ago. You know, 10 to 20,000 BC, they came over the Iberian, or the, you know, up there. Reiner, what's the name of that? You know, the Aleutian Island chain. They came through there and walked down. So if you're not Native American, your ancestors came here more recently. Some more recently than others. Some of us are children of immigrants. Some of us may have immigrated ourselves, and some of us our ancestors immigrated, you know, how many ever generations ago. Immigrants coming to this country, in many cases, have been subject to racism. Okay. And, you know, I'm including Africans as immigrants, but of course, you know, we know that Africans were not brought here on their own free will, but they were forced to come here as part of the slave trade. And I would encourage all of you, if you take a history, I'm sure there's a history class or something, Reiner, that talks about the slave trade and the African diaspora. I encourage all of you guys to...
we do have a class for next semester on the African diaspora.
Yeah, so I'd encourage all of you...
Listed with anthropology.
I'd encourage all of you guys to take that class. I think that'd be very, very important to know about the history of this country. Okay. So, you know, Africans coming to this country and treated very poorly, you know, enslaved. Other people coming to this country, maybe not quite treated quite as badly, but also still subject to racism, including some European peoples. Irish people brought to this country. Irish people were considered inferior. They were considered to have all sorts of bad characteristics. They like to drink and fight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you'll see stuff like this poster here that shows, on one hand, here is the African person of African descent. Here's the Irish person. Here in the middle is the European, Anglo-Teutonic, German, English person, right? And again, you see here's a picture also showing you here, here's the Irish guy, here's the black person. They're being characterized, stereotyped in a negative way. Okay. Later on, of course, when you have people from Latin America coming here, you also see racism toward people from Latin American descent. Okay. And of course, you have groups forming in the United States that are white supremacist groups. One you may know the most about is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Very interesting group. They're still around, and they're still doing stuff. They have a really very interesting, weird linguistic thing. They like the letter K, and so they came. This is something from like the 1920s. This is their sort of book of their code of conduct, ethics, their charter, and they call it, this is sort of a play on words, they call it the Cloran, which is a play on words of the Koran. And in here, they have all sorts of things. And you notice they spell character with a K. I don't really get the thing with the K, but whoever was starting the Ku Klux Klan was into the K thing. So, and this is online if you want to read this. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it's there online if you want to read it. Somebody to study. They looked at racism as a proportion of Google searches containing the N-word, and they looked at this sort of correlated with mortality among African Americans. And so this is their proxy for racism. And you could argue whether that's a good proxy or not. But if you want to look at racism against African Americans, this is at least a somewhat data-based map, and you can see where the red is the most racist areas and green is the least racist, and you can see the sort of corridor running from the south up into the mid-east west, the Midwest sort of here a little bit, some of the southern states being the area that has the greatest amount of racism. If you take my clinical psych class, 313 in the summer, second session, shameless plug, I will also show you maps of mortality due to cigarette smoking, cancer mortality, diabetes, obesity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's almost an exact overlay for this map. I should have brought that in. I'll change this lecture next year and bring those maps in and show you this. So racism against African Americans tends to go along with a bunch of other negative social things and health things. Okay. So a conclusion about that. Interesting enough, I like California. It's very interesting that here in Southern California, we're more racist than other places in California. Okay. Now, as a Northern Californian, somebody from the San Francisco Bay Area, I would have anecdotally told you that was true. That people in Northern California seem to me to be a lot less racist than people in Southern California. And I always thought that was just my, general, sorry to admit it, my general Northern California distrust and dislike of Southern Californians, because those Northern Californians think you're all weird down here and you stole our water, so we're not like that, right? And I always thought, yeah, they're more racist down in Southern California. Well, it turns out that may be true. On this map, anyway. At least racist against African Americans. So you can see it's very interesting. Right. What about Latin Americans? There's an interesting paper here. I think it's worth reading. Looking at this guy's looking at this paper, looking at the future of race relations in the United States, and looking at trying to understand how racist and racism is conceptualized in the United States. And he comes up with some interesting ideas here. One is that there are three models explaining the future of what he calls the white majority. Okay? So these are the three models. There's a white, non-white divide. Whiteness will continue to be an exclusive category in which Asians and Latinos, and obviously African Americans, will be excluded, mostly through socioeconomic exclusions. That's model one. Model two is a black, non-black divide, where whites will expand to include everyone but black people. So if you're Mexican or you're from, China or whatever, eventually you will be included as white, and eventually only African Americans will be the non-whites. They'll be the other race or category. And the last one, which is the one that he's sort of more of the proponent of, is this tri-racial order. The Latin Americanization of this country feeds into this, and this creates a system of whites at the pinnacle and those considered honorary whites in the middle, and of course African Americans, blacks at the bottom. And so this is, according to this article, and I think he has quite some good sources, that he makes a claim that this is sort of how race is conceptualized in the United States today, where you have whites at the top of the pyramid, and this includes people from Europe, Germans, now Irish, Italians. And by the way, remember, Irish and Italians did not start in this country as whites. Okay? Italians also, there was prejudice against Italians too. But now they're considered to be white, and you have assimilated Latinos. This would include Argentinians, Chileans, Cubans. You have new white immigrants. This would include Russians, Serbians, Albanians, etc. Okay? Then you have so-called honorary whites. This would be light and medium-skinned Latinos, Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, multiracial people from Asia. And then you have what they call at the bottom collected blacks. This would include African Americans. It will include people from lower socioeconomic classes in Asia, such as Cambodians, the Hmong people, Laotian people. It would include darker-skinned Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, West Indians, anybody immigrating from Africa, and also Native Americans. Okay? So he makes a case that this is sort of the category that you have now, you have in America now. And you might be able to, so I mean, one thing to think about as a thought experiment is to compare these racial categories now to what the Nazis were proposing. Okay? Now, it leaves the question, and I'll try to get back to this a little bit later, of where are Jewish people and where are another group that we haven't, it's been in the media a lot lately, Muslims, people of Muslim descent. Okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, by the way, I'm not saying this is good, so don't misdrew what I'm saying. I'm saying from the research that these people are doing, that this is what they're seeing out there among Americans, how Americans are conceptualizing their relationship with different peoples. Okay, so let's be clear. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm not saying this is. I'm just saying this is what the science is showing that people are thinking about. Yes.
What about socioeconomic status? That never seems to be entering any of these.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's a huge indicator, especially in the United States.
I think you do see it. I think again, if you look at people immigrate, again, it has to be here. I mean, I would. It has to be here. It has to be playing.
Class, most people say it doesn't exist in the United States.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, if I were creating this, I would be looking at the effect of class. But there is some research and some people who are writing who also say that for racism, that class does not necessarily eradicate racism. Does not eradicate people's conception of race. You could be a very rich African American person and still be subject to racism. And of course, if you hear people like movie stars or sports stars who are come from a minority group, they will pull up the paper. You can read their stories of racism. Okay? I have a friend of mine who is he's an ex-NFL football player. He lives in Thousand Oaks. He's a black man, and he will tell you all the stories about how many times he's been pulled over by the police in Thousand Oaks. Right? I mean, it's like it's tragic. Right? So I think I think class and socioeconomic status plays into here, but I don't think it erases these sort of things. Now, talk about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in this country seemed to peak in the early 90s, but has, by 2012, has been going down. And you can see here, the red are the serious incidents, and the Blue are the non-serious instances. It looks like as of 2016, non-serious instances of anti-Semitism going up. If you look at this graph, vandalism and harassment, anti-Semitism, we see that anti-Semitism has gone down, but by 2014 it seems like it's upturning again. So again, if you are concerned about anti-Semitism, this is something that the Anti-Defamation League, which is one of the groups that is interested in anti-Semitism, they're tracking this stuff. They're very concerned that now it's sort of on the uptick. What about anti-Muslim sentiment? This is something, of course, we are exposed to every day, and of course, the idea of banning Muslims from coming to this country has been played out, and there's been a lot of stuff on the media about Muslims in this country, people of Muslim descent in this country, and maybe some ideas that, for me, to some degree, hark back to Nazi Germany. I will admit, as a person who is at least ethnically Muslim, my dad comes from a Muslim country and is classified racially by the British as a Muslim, because he was a British citizen back in the day, and they put on his identification papers, Islam. They use that as a race, which is interesting. We have another discussion about that. I may be a little more concerned about this than other people, but I do find that this seems to be a concern, and of course the stereotypes about Muslims abound in our culture, that Muslims are all joining ISIS, they're in a secret cabal to overthrow the government, establish Sharia law, etc., etc., etc. And I'm here to tell you that most people of Muslim descent have no interest whatsoever in these things. It's like saying that Christians are terrorists because you had a Christian guy go to the top of a tower in Houston and start shooting people, and so therefore he's a terrorist. I think most people of Muslim descent don't like ISIS or any of the other extremist Islam groups any more than anybody else. If you talk to Muslims in this country, you'll see that they report a great deal of anti-Muslim sentiment. Also, by the way, I should mention this as well. LGBT people also reporting a lot of high levels of discrimination here, as were African Americans and Mexican Americans as well. Okay, Jewish people not so much. They're not feeling they're discriminated against, and Asian Americans not so much. This is from The Economist, from a poll done in The Economist. And if you look at this, U.S. Muslims who say there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims in the United States, 75% say this. Americans don't see Islam as mainstream of American society, 62%. U.S. media coverage of Muslims is unfair, 60%. And again, you can also break down, and I'm not going to be political here, but this is just for your own interest, if you break down views about Islam and American Muslims by general public Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, and Tea Party Republicans, you can see that there is a clear difference here. That the more right-wing your politics are, the more that you are going to have anti-Muslim sentiments. And you see the independent and general public is sort of there in between. Now, so we get back to this map of how Americans, in a way, are racist. And we can ask, what about Jews, Muslims, what about multiracial people? And what about the role of political beliefs? And we would add in what Reiner said, we would add in socioeconomic category. We'd add in, that should be here as well. And I don't really have an answer for that. What we do know is that this is the one metric that we do see here. Skin color plays a role. We would have to add in money. Okay. And I mention this because maybe some of you guys want to go into graduate school and you maybe need something to study. This is all, I think, grist for the mill. This is all stuff that needs more research. Okay. Now, why am I presenting you this sort of categorization of American racism here? Because I think this is inoculation. If you know about racism, you know about how people think about races, maybe this will cause you to think or talk to your friends about it, or get into a discussion with people about race, and especially about race being a social construct. Okay? So I want to end this talk very quickly to talk to you a little bit about genetics and genetic variation among humans. And this is where I started. Okay. And because we're now able to look at human genetics in a very sophisticated way. Okay. And patterns of genetic diversity can inform us about population history, because we can look at demographic events, we can look at people in different areas, we can examine DNA very carefully, and we can look at the degree which our history is written in our DNA. Now, human beings, we're Homo sapiens, fairly new species. We have not had a lot of time to accumulate genetic variation. And if you look at other species of animals on this earth, you'll see there's a lot more genetic variation among other animals, and speciation, it's hard to say, among other animal groups. Speciation meaning that you are not mating with a member of another species will not usually result in viable offspring. Okay? Human beings, races are not species. Okay? Races are not species. In other words, you can find the most different looking human being to you, and you can hook up with them and you can have a kid. Perfectly viable child. Okay? That's not true for other animals. And again, the biologists in me will encourage all of you to go to the Galapagos Islands and see the speciation that occurred on each and different island. You have like different kinds of iguanas and things on different islands. Different islands. Very interesting. Okay? The most important thing you need to know is that the extent of human variation is that no two humans, save identical twins, have ever been or will be genetically identical. Between any two human beings, the amount of genetic variation, biochemical individuality, is about 0.1%. This means that out of every one base pair out of 1,000 will be different between any two individuals. Okay? So that's an important thing to know about. If you want to look at genetic variation, I talked to you about adaptation. You can see a map of people have adapted. They have genetic adaptations toward different things. One I'm really interested in is this one, which you find among Tibetan people who adapted to living at very high altitudes. And you can find all sorts of things here. There's adaptations for alcohol processing in the body, all sorts of stuff here. And this is all very interesting stuff. These are adaptations to the environment. Okay? These do not make for separate species. And in many cases, you'll find different people coping with a different environment, the same kind of environments, and having different genetic variations to deal with that kind of thing. But this does not make people different races. Does not make them different species. And again, biological anthropologists are arguing, and still coming to grips. This is a paper from, I think this is 2009, and they're still trying to come to grips with this, okay? Looking at these things and trying to define what race is. The U.S. Census Bureau is a little more, I think, ahead of the curve, and this comes from the Census Bureau website. The Census Bureau defines race as a person's self-identification with one or more social groups. Okay? One or more social groups. Okay? So they are coming right out and saying, the Census Bureau coming right out and saying, race is a social construct. It is the social construct you choose. Some people may not like this. There was a great controversy about that white woman who was claiming to be African American a few weeks ago, and she is still the butt of late night talk show host jokes. By the Census Bureau definition, she could define herself as African American. Okay? Now, most people kind of, what's she doing, right? But this clearly shows you race as a social construct. Okay? And it's a social construct of your own choosing, not what somebody chooses for you. Okay? Interesting. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is broken out into, basically look at ethnicity as two categories for the Census Bureau. You're Hispanic or Latino or not. And so they're looking at ethnicity specifically around Latin American or Spanish heritage, which I think is really kind of interesting. One thing we do know that is correlated with these genetic variations, if you had to create groups of people, I don't think it's necessarily what you want to do, but you want to look at genetic variations, you'll see that it's correlated with language. So these adaptations, these small adaptations to the human genome seem to be correlated with language. That makes sense, right? That makes a lot of sense. Think about this. You are going to hook up with somebody. You go on Tinder, you swipe right, whatever it is you guys do nowadays. I don't know. Find somebody who's reasonably attractive to you, and you click on them. Let's meet for coffee, right? If they only speak Russian, they're not going to meet you for coffee. They don't know what you said, right? Maybe Google Translate. Let's say you meet them in person. You know, hard to hook up with somebody when language is a barrier, when you can't talk to them. Much easier to hook up with somebody you can talk to, right? And so what this map shows you is that, indeed, if you look at these small genetic variations, you'll see that it's very strongly clustered with language. So you see here, this is a European map. You see here, these are people from Spain, people from England. Here you see they cluster around language. So if you want to think of maybe a more positive replacement for race and racial categories, which are based on colonization and subjugation of people, but if you have to absolutely pigeonhole different people into a category, use language. And the nice thing about language is that you can always learn another language, right? And that's nice. So you can always then include yourself in whatever category you feel like by learning a language. So I think I'll end there.